Alright, let's go. Number 10, the Beak. In 1656, the physician Charles Delorme stood in the plague wards of Rome, fitted into a costume that modern eyes read as pure nightmare fuel. A leather coat waxed against moisture, goggles of thick glass, and jutting from the front of his hood, a curved beak the length of a man's forearm stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, camphor, and myrrh. He was not performing a ritual. He was, according to the medical theory of his era, protecting himself from miasma, the poisoned air believed to carry plague from the dead and dying to the living. The beak held the aromatics away from the nose and mouth, filtering the supposedly toxic vapor before it could be inhaled. For nearly 3 centuries, historians treated the plague doctor costume as a symbol of medieval superstition, a Halloween silhouette. Quackery in leather and glass, the Catholic Church did not always agree that these men should be practicing at all. In several Italian city-states, self-styled plague physicians operating outside licensed medical guilds were fined, expelled, or banned outright, accused of extracting money from the dying with theatrical nonsense. The costume itself was mocked in pamphlets. Contemporary satirists drew the beaked doctors as carrion birds circling the sick, profiting from misery dressed as science. And yet, here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Miasma theory was wrong. Plague is not carried on foul-smelling air. But the beak doctors had, by accident, built something startlingly close to a respirator. The waxed leather coat was an early barrier garment, a full-body seal against fluid contact centuries before anyone understood germ theory. The glass goggles sealed the eyes, a mucous membrane through which pathogens can enter the body, a fact virology would not establish until the 20th century. And the herbs stuffed into the beak were not random. Many of them, camphor, myrrh, dried rose petals, thyme, possess genuine antimicrobial and insect repellent properties confirmed by modern laboratory analysis. They would not have filtered airborne Yersinia pestis, but they may have deterred the fleas that actually carried it and repelled some of the volume of bacteria clinging to fabric and skin. The implications are staggering. A medical costume built on a completely incorrect theory of disease transmission independently arrived at 3 of the 4 pillars of modern infection control: full-body barrier protection, eye protection, and a rudimentary filtration layer. Not because Delorme understood germs, because centuries of trial, error, and burying colleagues had taught European physicians that something about proximity to the sick killed you, and the coat, the goggles, and the beak were the best defense available against a threat they could feel but could not name. Modern PPE designers studying the history of infection control have noted the resemblance without irony. A full hazmat suit and the 17th century plague doctor's uniform share a structural logic. Seal every opening, filter what you breathe, trust nothing to the open air. The beak doctors were laughed at for 400 years. Then, a global pandemic put doctors in Wuhan and New York and Milan into modern versions of nearly the same silhouette, and the laughing stopped. There is a further wrinkle to the story that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. Delorme's costume was not universally adopted even in its own era. Many town councils, wary of the expense and the theatrical appearance of the outfit, refused to fund it for municipal plague doctors, leaving ordinary physicians to face infected patients with nothing more than a handkerchief pressed to the face. The towns that did invest in the full costume for their plague physicians recorded, in several surviving municipal records, lower mortality among their medical staff than towns that did not. A correlation contemporary town clerks noted with some puzzlement but no explanatory theory. They could see that the expensive leather and glass men were surviving their rounds through the pest houses at a noticeably higher rate than physicians working without the costume. They simply had no framework for understanding why a waxed coat and a stuffed beak should matter, only that it seemed empirically to matter quite a lot. Number 9. The Maggots. On the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars, French military surgeon Dominique Jean Leray noticed something that violated every instinct a physician was trained to have. Soldiers left wounded on the field for days, their injuries crawling with fly larvae, were healing faster and with fewer infections than soldiers whose wounds had been kept clean and covered. Larry wrote about it. He was largely ignored, or worse, treated as describing a horror rather than a discovery. The image of maggots consuming living flesh was, to 19th century sensibility, simply too repulsive to investigate seriously. Hospitals banned the practice outright. Surgeons who allowed larvae near a wound risked their reputation and, in some documented cases, formal sanction from medical boards who considered it filthy, unprofessional, and a step backward from the sterile ideal that modern surgery was trying to build. But the observation did not disappear. It resurfaced during the American Civil War, when field surgeons on both sides independently noted the same pattern. Confederate surgeon John Forney Zacharias treated soldiers whose wounds had become infested and reported, with evident surprise, that the maggot-infested wounds cleaned themselves of dead tissue and closed with unusual speed, while wounds kept scrupulously clean by the standards of the day festered and killed. Here is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing, because the practice was not simply forgotten. It was actively suppressed. As antiseptic surgery developed in the late 19th century, and later as antibiotics arrived in the 20th, the entire discipline of medicine organized itself around the elimination of all organic contamination from a wound. The idea of deliberately introducing larvae into an open injury became, within a single generation, professionally unthinkable. Hospitals that had quietly used the technique stopped. Textbooks omitted it. An entire lineage of practical battlefield knowledge, refined independently by multiple armies over more than a century, was buried beneath the triumph of penicillin. Then, in the late 1980s, something happened that no one in the antiseptic era expected. Antibiotic-resistant infections began appearing in hospital wards that all the sterile technique in the world could not touch. Orthopedic surgeon Ronald Sherman at the University of California, Irvine, went looking for alternatives and found the discarded 19th century battlefield reports. He ran the trials. The maggots worked exactly as Larry and Zacharias had described. Fly larvae of the species Lucilia sericata consume only dead and infected tissue, leaving healthy tissue untouched. They secrete enzymes that break down necrotic material and release antimicrobial compounds that suppress bacterial growth directly in the wound bed, including strains resistant to modern antibiotics. In 2004, the United States Food and Drug Administration formally approved medicinal maggots as a prescription medical device, not a folk remedy, not an alternative therapy, a cleared, regulated treatment, manufactured in sterile labs and shipped to hospitals in small mesh pouches, used today on diabetic ulcers, pressure sores, and infected wounds that conventional treatment has failed to close. The technique medical boards once considered too disgusting to permit is now stocked in wound care clinics across the developed world. It took 180 years, 2 wars, and an antibiotic resistance crisis to bring it back. Number 8. The green bread. For centuries, peasant households across Europe kept a peculiar habit that horrified visiting physicians and, in more than one documented instance, drew condemnation from local authorities concerned with public hygiene. When bread went moldy, it was not always thrown away. In parts of rural France, Germany, Poland, and the Balkans, the moldy portion was deliberately packed into open wounds, or the bread itself was left to spoil further, soaked in water, and the resulting liquid applied as a poultice to 18th and 19th century sanitary reformers. This looked like exactly the kind of ignorant, unhygienic peasant practice that modern public health was supposed to eliminate. Sanitary boards in several European cities issued explicit warnings against the use of spoiled food as medicine, folding the practice into broader campaigns against folk healing that authorities viewed as dangerous superstition standing in the way of scientific progress. The moldy bread cure was pushed underground, practiced quietly by grandmothers and midwives, dismissed in print as backward. The people using it did not know why it worked. They simply knew, generation after generation, in villages that had no contact with each other, that a wound packed with certain kinds of mold healed rather than festered. The implications are staggering because this was not an isolated superstition. Similar practices have been documented independently among ancient Egyptian physicians who applied moldy bread to wounds as early as 1550 BC, according to surviving medical papyri. Traditional Chinese medicine texts describe using moldy soybean curd for infections. Serbian and Russian folk medicine used moldy bread and moldy leather soaked in water as topical treatments for centuries. Multiple unconnected civilizations across multiple continents arrived at the same conclusion through nothing but accumulated observation. Then, in September 1928, Alexander Fleming returned from a holiday to his cluttered London laboratory and noticed a stray mold contaminating one of his bacterial culture plates. Around the mold, the bacteria had died. The mold was Penicillium notatum. The substance it produced, penicillin, would become the foundation of modern antibiotic medicine. Fleming did not know about the peasant poultices. He was not building on folklore. His discovery was, by every account, an accident. But the accident confirmed, in a controlled laboratory setting, exactly what unlettered villagers across 3 continents had been quietly practicing for centuries without ever being able to explain the mechanism. The mold on that bread was very likely secreting some concentration of the same antibiotic compound Fleming isolated. The peasants banned by sanitary boards for spreading spoiled food on open wounds were, without knowing it, applying a crude form of the most important drug class in the history of medicine, a full century before science caught up to them. Number 7. The bitter bark. Hippocrates wrote about it in the 5th century BC, describing a bitter powder made from willow bark and leaves that eased pain and reduced fever. For nearly 2,000 years afterward, the treatment persisted at the margins of European medicine, chewed by peasants with toothaches, brewed into tea by midwives easing the pain of childbirth, and largely dismissed by the university-trained physicians of the medieval and early modern period, who preferred bloodletting, purging, and theories of bodily humors that had nothing to do with tree bark. By the 18th century, willow bark had become associated closely enough with folk healing and unlicensed practitioners that the medical establishment treated its use with open contempt. Officially sanctioned physicians in England and on the continent viewed reliance on hedgerow remedies as a mark of quackery, and in some jurisdictions, unlicensed healers dispensing such remedies for profit could be fined or barred from practicing, part of a broader effort by emerging medical colleges to consolidate authority over what counted as legitimate treatment. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because the peasants were, once again, right, and the university men were not. In 1763, English clergyman Edward Stone conducted what may be one of the first documented clinical trials in medical history, administering dried, powdered willow bark to more than 50 parishioners suffering from fever, and reporting consistent, reproducible relief. His paper, submitted to the Royal Society, was received with polite interest and then largely ignored for decades, in part because it originated from a country clergyman rather than a credentialed physician, and in part because it offered no theoretical explanation the medical establishment of the day could accept. It took until 1828 for French and German chemists to isolate the active compound in willow bark, a bitter yellow substance named salicin. It took until 1897 for a chemist at the German company Bayer, Felix Hoffmann, to synthesize a more stable, less stomach-irritating derivative of salicin's breakdown product, acetylsalicylic acid. Bayer called it aspirin. It became and remains the most widely used medication in human history, taken by an estimated 100 billion doses a year worldwide, prescribed for pain, fever, inflammation, and, since the 1980s, for the prevention of heart attack and stroke through its effects on blood clotting. The active mechanism, inhibition of the enzymes that produce inflammatory compounds called prostaglandins, would not be understood until 1971, when British pharmacologist John Vane finally explained why willow bark worked. 2,400 years after Hippocrates first wrote it down. 2 centuries after, English physicians dismissed the men and women who brewed it as bark-chewing hedge doctors, standing in the way of real medicine. What makes the willow bark case particularly striking is how many independent traditions converged on the same tree. Medieval Welsh medical texts, the physicians of Myddfai, recommend willow preparations for pain and swelling centuries before Stone's parish trial. Chinese medical texts describe similar bark preparations from related salix species used for fever. Native American communities across multiple, unconnected nations independently used willow bark tea for headache and joint pain, a use documented by 19th century ethnobotanists who were, at the time, more interested in cataloging the practice as curiosity than in testing it. 4 separate medical traditions, with no meaningful contact between them for most of recorded history, arrived at the same tree, the same bark, and roughly the same application. Vane's 1971 paper did not just validate Edward Stone's Parrish experiment. It quietly validated a piece of botanical medicine that had been independently rediscovered on at least 3 continents. Number 6. The 40 Days, in 1377, the Maritime Republic of Ragusa, the city we now call Dubrovnik, issued an ordinance that would outlive the empires that came after it. Ships arriving from plague-afflicted ports were required to anchor offshore and wait. Not for a week, not for 2. For 30 days, later extended to 40, a period the Venetians who copied the practice would call quarantena, from the Italian for 40, no cargo, no passengers. No contact with the shore until the isolation period had passed without illness appearing among those aboard. The measure was deeply unpopular. Merchants whose goods rotted in holds while ships sat idle in harbor petitioned against it. Sailors confined for weeks aboard cramped vessels rioted in more than one recorded instance. Local authorities in several Mediterranean ports, under pressure from trade guilds losing fortunes to the delay, quietly waived or shortened the quarantine period for well-connected merchants. A corruption that public health officials of the time explicitly warned would cost lives. In some cities, physicians who insisted on enforcing the full 40-day isolation against the wishes of powerful trading families found themselves removed from their posts. The people enforcing quarantine did not know what a bacterium was. They did not know Yersinia pestis existed, would not know for another 500 years. They had no germ theory, no microscopes capable of resolving anything at that scale, no concept of an incubation period in the biological sense we use today. What they had was pattern recognition, refined over repeated outbreaks that had killed, in the case of the Black Death alone, an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population within a period of roughly 4 years in the 14th century. They had noticed empirically that illness did not always appear immediately after exposure, that a ship could arrive apparently healthy and then, days later, begin dying. 40 days was not a number derived from clinical study of incubation periods. It carried religious significance, echoing the 40 days of Lent, of Noah's flood, of Christ's fast in the wilderness. But whatever its origin, the number worked, because it was long enough to reliably exceed the incubation period of nearly every epidemic disease Mediterranean trade routes were likely to carry. The implications are staggering when you consider that this same basic principle, delayed by centuries of resistance from merchants and travelers, who found isolation inconvenient and expensive, remains the single most effective non-pharmaceutical intervention against novel pathogens available to modern public health. When SARS emerged in 2003, quarantine protocols nearly identical in structure to Ragusa's 14th century ordinance were what stopped it from becoming a global pandemic. When COVID-19 emerged in 2019, the same fundamental tool, mandatory isolation of the exposed for a period exceeding the disease's incubation window, was deployed by governments around the world, sometimes against the same kind of economic and political resistance that Mediterranean merchants voiced against Ragusa's harbor masters 6.5 centuries earlier. The 40 days did not come from a laboratory. It came from grief, repetition, and the stubborn insistence of harbor officials who kept enforcing an unpopular rule because they had watched what happened when nobody enforced it at all. Number 5. The hole in the skull. Archaeologists working burial sites across Neolithic and medieval Europe have, for over a century, uncovered something that should not exist if early medicine was as crude as popular imagination assumes. Skulls, hundreds of them, spanning thousands of years and multiple continents, bearing a hole deliberately cut or scraped into the bone. Trepanation. The practice of opening the skull while the patient was still alive, for much of the 19th and early 20th century. Archaeologists who found these skulls assumed the holes were ritualistic, evidence of some superstitious attempt to release evil spirits believed to cause seizures, headaches, or madness. And in some documented medieval contexts, that assumption was correct. Church authorities in parts of medieval Europe periodically condemned certain healers for trepanning patients under the justification of exorcising demons, a practice officially banned in several dioceses as heretical or fraudulent, and healers caught performing it under those pretenses could be punished. But here is where the archaeological record becomes genuinely disturbing, because a significant number of these skulls show something the ritual explanation cannot account for: bone regrowth around the edges of the hole, smooth, healed margins. Evidence that the patient survived the procedure, in some cases by years, in some cases having undergone the operation more than once. Analysis of skulls from sites in Peru, France, and across the medieval European record shows survival rates for trepanation in skilled hands. In some series, it exceeded 50%, a figure that would remain unmatched by cranial surgery until well into the modern anesthetic era. Medieval and earlier practitioners had, through trial and accumulated observation, passed down through healing lineages, worked out something close to a functional indication for the procedure, relieving pressure inside the skull following severe head trauma. Modern neurosurgery confirms the underlying logic completely. A traumatic head injury can cause the brain to swell inside a rigid, unyielding skull, a condition called intracranial pressure that, left untreated, compresses brain tissue and can kill the patient. The standard modern treatment for severe cases is a decompressive craniectomy, in which a section of skull is surgically removed to allow the swollen brain room to expand without being crushed against bone. It is, structurally, trepanation. Performed with sterile instruments, imaging guidance, and general anesthesia rather than a flint blade, and presumably something to bite down on. But the core insight that a swollen or injured brain needs the pressure of an intact skull relieved to survive is the same insight that Neolithic and medieval healers reached through nothing but watching which patients lived and which ones died, and adjusting accordingly over what must have been thousands of years of accumulated, unrecorded trial and error. The implications are staggering. An operation modern medicine treats as a last resort neurosurgical intervention, requiring years of specialized training, was independently developed by multiple prehistoric and medieval cultures with no written medical tradition, no anatomical textbooks, and no anesthesia beyond, at best, alcohol or opium poppy extract. They banned it when it was practiced as exorcism. They kept practicing it when it worked as medicine, and somewhere in that long, bloody, empirical record is proof that the line between primitive superstition and legitimate surgical indication was thinner, and crossed earlier than most people assume. Number 4. The small beer. Travel through any medieval European town, and you would find something that strikes modern sensibility as reckless. Children drinking beer, not occasionally, not as a rare treat, but as a matter of daily household routine, alongside adults, at breakfast, at midday meals, at supper. The beverage in question was what brewers called small beer, or small ale, a low-alcohol brew, often under 1% by volume, produced from the second or third runnings of the mash after the stronger beer had already been drawn off. It was, in effect, barely alcoholic at all, and it was, for centuries, safer to drink than the water most medieval towns could offer. Municipal authorities in several English and continental cities did, at various points, attempt to restrict or tax small beer production, generally not out of concern for public health, but out of a desire to control the lucrative brewing trade, license-favored guild breweries, and squeeze tax revenue from a beverage that nearly every household in Europe consumed in enormous daily quantities. Unlicensed home brewers, overwhelmingly women, were fined or shut down in numerous documented cases, a suppression driven by economics and guild politics rather than science, but one that nonetheless pushed household-level production of a genuinely protective beverage into legal jeopardy. The people brewing it had no concept of waterborne pathogens. They did not know that the water sources feeding medieval towns, often shared with livestock, laundry, and sewage runoff, carried bacteria capable of causing dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. What they knew through centuries of observation was that households that drank beer stayed healthier than households that drank straight from the well or the river, especially in crowded towns where sanitation was minimal. The mechanism, confirmed only much later by microbiology, involves two separate protective processes. First, the brewing process required boiling the wort, which killed the overwhelming majority of pathogens present in the water before fermentation ever began. Second, the fermentation process itself lowered the pH and introduced alcohol and antimicrobial compounds produced by yeast, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused most waterborne medieval illness, even at the low alcohol concentrations found in small beer. The implications are staggering when set against the demographic reality of the medieval world. Infant and child mortality from diarrheal disease was, for most of human history, one of the leading causes of death before the age of 5. Populations that had, through pure accumulated trial and error, adopted the daily habit of drinking boiled, fermented, mildly antimicrobial beverages instead of raw surface water were, without anyone understanding why, protecting their children from some of the deadliest pathogens circulating through pre-modern towns. Modern public health science did not validate this practice until well into the 20th century, when researchers studying historical demography began correlating regions of high small beer consumption with measurably lower rates of certain gastrointestinal disease mortality relative to comparable populations that relied more heavily on unboiled water. A daily habit taxed and restricted by city guilds protecting their profits turned out to be one of the more effective, if entirely accidental, public health interventions of the pre-modern world. The same protective logic appears, independently, in the tea-drinking traditions of medieval and early modern Asia, where the boiling of water required to prepare tea conferred a nearly identical benefit, and in the wine-drinking regions of southern Europe, where the acidity and alcohol content of table wine mixed into daily drinking water produced comparable antimicrobial effects. None of these cultures shared a common origin for the practice. None of them had any theoretical basis for understanding why boiled, fermented, or acidified beverages protected against illness better than raw water. They had only the accumulated, unrecorded evidence of which households buried fewer children, repeated across enough generations that the habit calcified into simple, unquestioned custom, the kind of custom that outlives its own explanation by centuries. Number 3. The empty stomach physicians in the medieval and early modern periods, working from theories of humoral balance that modern medicine has long since discarded, frequently prescribed fasting during illness, not eating, sometimes for days at a stretch, alongside fever, injury, or infection, on the theory that food fed the imbalance of humors believed to be causing the sickness in the first place. The practice drew sharp criticism even within its own era. Prominent voices in later medieval and Renaissance medicine argued that fasting weakened patients who needed strength to fight illness. And in several documented instances, physicians who insisted on prolonged therapeutic fasting for feverish patients, particularly children, were accused of malpractice by rival practitioners and by worried families who watched their sick relatives grow gaunt under a regimen that seemed, on its face, to be starving the sick rather than healing them. Some town physicians were formally reprimanded by medical guilds for fasting protocols judged too severe. The humoral theory behind the practice was, by every modern standard, wrong. There is no black bile, no yellow bile, no imbalance of the four humors to correct. And yet the underlying instinct that reducing food intake during certain kinds of acute illness produces a measurable physiological benefit has found unexpected support from a completely different scientific direction in the 21st century. Research into a cellular process called autophagy, work for which Japanese cell biologist Yoshinori Osumi received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016, has demonstrated that periods of caloric restriction trigger cells to break down and recycle damaged internal components, including misfolded proteins and dysfunctional structures that accumulate during infection and cellular stress. This process appears to play a measurable role in immune regulation, and animal studies have shown that short-term fasting can, in specific circumstances, help the body clear certain bacterial infections more efficiently by reducing the nutrient availability that some pathogens depend on to replicate rapidly, while simultaneously reallocating cellular energy toward immune and repair functions. None of this vindicates the harshest medieval fasting regimens, some of which genuinely did endanger malnourished or already weakened patients, and modern clinical guidance on fasting during illness remains carefully qualified, dependent on the type of infection, the patient's baseline nutritional status, and close medical supervision that no medieval physician could offer. The historical practice, applied indiscriminately and without any real understanding of mechanism, undoubtedly harmed some patients as often as it helped others. But the implications are still striking. A treatment rooted in a completely false theory of disease, criticized within its own time as dangerous starvation dressed up as medicine, has produced, in the specific and narrow context of certain infections, a genuine physiological signal that 21st century cell biology is only now beginning to explain. The medieval physicians who fasted their feverish patients could not have told you what autophagy was. They had watched, across generations of practice, that it sometimes seemed to help, and built a wrong theory around a data point that, it turns out, was not entirely wrong. Number 2. The cold water. Wound care in the medieval period varied wildly by region, practitioner, and available resources, but one persistent thread runs through surviving surgical manuscripts from England to the Islamic world to the Byzantine Empire. Washing fresh wounds in cold water, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes for extended periods, rather than immediately covering, cauterizing, or packing them. The practice sat uneasily alongside the dominant surgical theory of the era, which held that wounds needed to generate what physicians called laudable pus, a thick discharge believed to be a necessary and healthy part of the healing process. Surgeons who favored cold water irrigation over the promotion of suppuration found themselves, in several documented academic disputes across medieval European medical schools, on the losing side of formal debate, their methods dismissed by university-trained colleagues as crude battlefield expedients unworthy of proper medical theory. In more than one instance, surgeons practicing outside official guild sanction who used cold water treatment on the poor, unable to afford formally trained physicians, were accused by licensed colleagues of practicing medicine without proper theoretical grounding, a charge that in some cities carried real legal and professional consequences. The dismissal was, in hindsight, almost entirely backward. Modern wound care research has demonstrated repeatedly that cold water irrigation of a fresh wound provides several measurable benefits that the laudable pus theory actively worked against. Cold water causes local vasoconstriction, reducing blood flow to the injury site and limiting swelling and bruising in the critical first hours after trauma. It mechanically flushes bacteria, debris, and foreign material out of the wound before infection can take hold, a function directly opposed to the deliberate cultivation of pus that dominant medieval theory encouraged. And clean, cold water, particularly compared to the era's alternative treatments, which frequently involved packing wounds with substances ranging from animal dung to unclean cloth in the belief that they promoted healing, represented a genuinely superior standard of hygiene almost by accident. The implications are staggering when set against how long it took formal medicine to catch up. It was not until the work of Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s, and later Louis Pasteur's germ theory in the 1860s, and Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic surgical technique shortly afterward, that the medical establishment definitively abandoned the promotion of pus as a therapeutic goal, and embraced clean, irrigated wounds as the correct standard of care. That shift, treated today as one of the foundational triumphs of modern medicine, took nearly a century to fully displace laudable pus theory from mainstream teaching. The battlefield surgeons and rural healers who had been quietly irrigating wounds in cold water for centuries before Lister, dismissed by their university-trained peers as unsophisticated, were practicing something closer to correct technique the entire time. They could not explain vasoconstriction. They could not explain bacterial load. They had simply noticed, wound after wound, patient after patient, that the ones washed clean in cold water tended to heal, while the ones packed and left to fester too often did not. Number 1. The silver, across medieval Europe, among households wealthy enough to own it. A strange domestic habit persisted for centuries, with no consistent theoretical justification anyone could offer. Milk, water, and wine were stored in silver vessels. Coins of silver were dropped into barrels of water and milk to keep them from spoiling. Wounds were sometimes packed with silver leaf or washed with water that had stood in silver containers. The Catholic Church and civic authorities in several regions periodically expressed suspicion of the practice when it crossed from simple household habit into the domain of folk healers who sold silver-infused water as a cure for ailments ranging from infection to plague itself. Healers making such medical claims for silver treatments were, in a number of documented cases across late medieval and early modern Europe, investigated, fined, or barred from practicing by authorities who viewed the sale of metallic remedies to the desperate and the dying as exploitation, dressed up as medicine, a suspicion that, given the enormous amount of genuine quackery circulating at the time, was frequently justified, and yet, once again, buried inside a practice, tangled up with genuine fraud, was a real and measurable effect that took modern chemistry centuries to isolate and explain. Silver ions, it turns out, are genuinely antimicrobial. They disrupt the cell membranes and interfere with the metabolic processes of a wide range of bacteria, a property that has nothing to do with any theory medieval Europe possessed, and everything to do with the specific chemistry of silver atoms interacting with microbial cell walls. Water or milk stored for extended periods in silver vessels does measurably develop a lower bacterial load than the same liquid stored in vessels made of other materials, a phenomenon researchers now sometimes refer to informally as the oligodynamic effect, first rigorously described by Swiss botanist Carl Wilhelm von Nageli in 1893, though the practical household use long predated any scientific explanation. The implications are staggering, and they extend directly into modern medicine. Silver sulfadiazine cream has been a standard treatment for burn wounds since the 1960s, prescribed specifically for its antimicrobial properties in preventing infection in patients whose damaged skin leaves them acutely vulnerable to bacterial colonization. Silver-impregnated dressings are used today in modern wound care for exactly the same reason medieval households packed silver leaf against open injuries, to suppress bacterial growth in a wound that cannot yet be sealed. Silver nanoparticle coatings are now applied to catheters, surgical instruments, and hospital surfaces specifically to reduce the bacterial contamination that spreads hospital-acquired infection. The household habit of dropping a silver coin into a milk pail, mocked when peddled by folk healers as a plague cure, dismissed by church authorities, suspicious of anyone selling metal as medicine, turns out to rest on a genuine chemical property that 21st century burn units, catheter manufacturers, and hospital infection control departments now depend on every single day: 10 treatments. 10 centuries of accumulated observation, refined not in laboratories but in kitchens, battlefields, plague wards, and harbor quarantine stations, by people who had no germ theory, no microscopes, no understanding of cellular biology, and who were, in nearly every case documented here, mocked, fined, restricted, or formally banned by the official medical and civic authorities of their own time. The pattern across all 10 is the same. A practice emerges from nothing but repeated trial and accumulated death. It survives because it works, even though no one can explain why. Official institutions, operating from more prestigious but ultimately incorrect theories, dismiss it, restrict it, or actively suppress it. And then, decades or centuries later, a laboratory somewhere finally isolates the mechanism, and the folk remedy that was banned as ignorance is revealed to have been operating on principles science had simply not yet discovered. The willowbark truers were not primitive. The moldy bread poultice was not filth. The maggots were not a horror to be eliminated. They were centuries of empirical medicine, built by people history remembers as backward, waiting patiently in the archive for science to catch up and tell them they had been right all along. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.